What happens when a cowboy returns home after years away, only to discover his best friend has married the woman he loved? In the dusty plains of Montana, Jake Mitchell is about to uncover a betrayal so deep it will shatter everything he believed about loyalty, friendship, and love. But the truth he discovers goes far beyond what anyone could imagine. This is a story of broken promises, hidden secrets, and a revelation that will change 3 lives forever. Jake Mitchell had been gone for 5 long years, riding the rodeo circuit from Texas to Wyoming, trying to forget the life he'd left behind in Willow Creek, Montana. The dust from countless arenas had settled into his bones, but nothing could settle the ache in his heart. He'd left home with promises to return for Sarah, the rancher's daughter who had captured his soul with her emerald eyes and gentle smile. They had planned a future together, a small ranch where they could raise horses and build a family they both dreamed of. But life on the rodeo circuit was harder than Jake had anticipated. Injuries piled up, prize money was scarce, and letters from home became increasingly infrequent. Sarah's last letter, received 8 months ago, had been brief and distant. She wrote about the ranch, the weather, the town gossip, but there was something missing. The warmth, the longing, the love that had once filled every line of her correspondence. Now, as Jake's weathered pickup truck crested the hill overlooking Willow Creek, his heart hammered against his ribs. The familiar landscape spread before him like a painting frozen in time. The Johnson Ranch sprawled across the valley floor, its white farmhouse gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cattle dotted the pastures, and the old oak tree, where he and Sarah had carved their initials, still stood sentinel by the creek. But something was different. As Jake drove down Main Street, he noticed new faces, changes to storefronts, and a general air of prosperity that hadn't existed when he'd left. The town seemed to have grown and thrived in his absence. His destination was clear: the Johnson Ranch, where Sarah lived with her aging father. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, imagining their reunion, the explanations, the forgiveness, and ultimately, the wedding they had postponed for far too long. Jake pulled into the familiar gravel driveway, his hands trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. The ranch looked immaculate, better maintained than he remembered. New fencing gleamed in the sunlight. The barn had been freshly painted, and expensive-looking equipment sat in the yard. Someone had been investing serious money into this place. As he stepped out of his truck, adjusting his worn cowboy hat, Jake heard laughter coming from behind the house. A woman's laugh, light, musical, achingly familiar. His pulse quickened as he rounded the corner of the farmhouse, following the sound. What he saw stopped him cold in his tracks, the blood draining from his face as if he'd been struck by lightning. There, on the back porch of the Johnson Ranch house, sat Sarah in a white rocking chair, her golden hair catching the late afternoon light. She was more beautiful than Jake remembered, radiant in a way that made his chest tighten with longing. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, in the matching rocking chair that old Mr. Johnson used to occupy, sat a man Jake recognized all too well. Marcus Webb, his childhood best friend and former ranch hand. Marcus had his arm draped casually around Sarah's shoulders, and she was leaning into him with the comfortable intimacy of long familiarity. On Sarah's finger, Jake could see the glint of a wedding ring catching the sunlight like a blade to his heart. The scene was domestic, peaceful, and utterly devastating. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined during countless lonely nights on the road. Jake stood frozen behind the corner of the house, unable to move forward or retreat. Marcus was telling some story, gesturing animatedly with his free hand, and Sarah was laughing with genuine joy. They looked happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way that made Jake feel like an intruder in his own memories. This was supposed to be his life, his future, his wife sitting in that rocking chair. Marcus had always been the steady one, the reliable friend who helped Jake through his father's death and supported his rodeo dreams. He was the kind of man who fixed things with his hands, who showed up when you needed him, who kept his promises. Everything Jake had failed to be when he chose the uncertainty of the rodeo over the security of home. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. His best friend had become everything Sarah needed, while Jake was chasing glory in dusty arenas hundreds of miles away. The rational part of Jake's mind understood what had happened. He had left with vague promises and sporadic communication. Sarah was a beautiful, intelligent woman who deserved love and stability, not empty promises from a man who might never return. Marcus had been there, probably helping with the ranch, being the partner Jake should have been. It made sense. It was logical. It was the right thing for everyone involved. But understanding didn't make the pain any less excruciating. Jake felt as though someone had reached into his chest and torn out his heart, leaving a gaping wound that the Montana wind seemed to blow right through. 5 years of dreaming, planning, and hoping had been shattered in a single moment. The life he thought was waiting for him had moved on without him. As Jake stood there, struggling with the urge to flee or confront them, he noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Through the window of the house, he could see movement, the shadow of a small figure running through the living room. A child. Sarah and Marcus had a child together. The family Jake had dreamed of building with Sarah was now a reality, just without him in it. Jake managed to retreat to his truck without being seen, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The logical thing would be to drive away, maybe check into the motel on the highway, and figure out his next move. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a nagging feeling that there was more to this story than a simple case of lost love and missed opportunities. That evening, Jake found himself at Murphy's Saloon, the only bar in Willow Creek, nursing a whiskey and trying to process what he'd witnessed. The familiar faces around him offered both comfort and painful reminders of the life he'd abandoned. Old Pete, the town's unofficial historian and biggest gossip, eventually sidled up to the bar beside him. "Jake Mitchell, I'll be damned," Pete said, squinting through his thick glasses. "Heard you were back in town. Hell of a thing, timing and all." There was something in Pete's voice, a hesitation that suggested he knew exactly why Jake's timing was significant. "Just passing through," Jake replied, not ready to admit he'd planned to stay. Pete ordered another beer and shook his head slowly. Shame about what happened. Real shame. Sarah's a good woman, always was. Deserved better than what she got. The old man's words were cryptic, loaded with meaning that Jake couldn't quite grasp. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his journalist instincts kicking in despite his emotional turmoil. Pete glanced around the bar nervously, then leaned closer. "Well, I probably shouldn't say nothing, but since you're her ... since you were... hell, you deserve to know the truth." He paused, taking a long drink before continuing. "That marriage of theirs, it ain't what it appears to be. Started real sudden-like, right after Sarah's daddy got sick. Marcus, he stepped in to help run the ranch, and next thing anyone knew, they were married." Jake's heart began to race. "What are you trying to say, Pete?" "I'm saying that girl loved you something fierce, Jake. Even after you've been gone 3 years, she still wore that little locket you gave her. Still talked about you coming home. Then her daddy got the cancer, and everything changed overnight. Marcus started showing up every day, helping with the ranch work, paying for treatments. Real generous of him, everyone thought." The old man paused again, his weathered face creasing with concern. "But generosity sometimes comes with a price, if you know what I mean." Sarah went from grieving her daddy's diagnosis to planning a wedding in about 2 weeks. Folks in town, well, we had our suspicions about why things moved so fast. Jake felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. "What kind of suspicions?" Pete finished his beer and stood to leave. The kind that make a man wonder if a wedding was more about saving a ranch than celebrating love. Marcus Webb always did have his eye on the Johnson spread. Prime land, good water rights, perfect for expanding operations. He placed a gnarled hand on Jake's shoulder. You might want to talk to Doc Henderson. He knows more about what really happened to old Johnson than most folks." The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside Doc Henderson's clinic, his mind racing with questions and dark possibilities. The elderly physician had delivered half the babies in Willow Creek and kept the town's secrets better than any priest. If anyone knew the truth about what had happened to Sarah's father, it would be Doc Henderson. The clinic was quiet in the early morning hours, and Doc Henderson looked surprised to see Jake walk through the door. The old man had aged considerably in 5 years, his hair now completely white and his shoulders more stooped, but his eyes were still sharp and knowing. "Jake Mitchell," Doc said, removing his reading glasses. "I wondered when you'd show up. Heard you were back in town." There was no judgment in his voice, just the weary tone of a man who had seen too much of life's cruelties. "Doc, I need to ask you about Mr. Johnson, about what happened to him." Jake's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched at his sides. Doc Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face with the intensity of a man making a difficult decision. Finally, he gestured toward his office. "Close the door and sit down, son. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room." Jake's heart pounded as he settled into the worn leather chair across from Doc's desk. The physician opened a file cabinet, retrieved a thick folder, and placed it on the desk between them. "Robert Johnson died of pancreatic cancer. That much is true," Doc began slowly. "But the timeline everyone thinks they know is wrong. Robert was diagnosed 18 months before he died, not 6 months like everyone believes. He was my patient, and he specifically asked me to keep the diagnosis confidential. He wanted to handle his affairs privately, without the whole town pitying him." Jake leaned forward, sensing there was more to the story. "Here's what nobody knows," Doc continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Marcus Webb knew about Robert's condition long before Sarah did. Robert had taken out several loans against the ranch to pay for experimental treatments. When those treatments failed, Marcus approached him with a proposition. He offered to pay off all the debts and ensure Sarah would never lose the ranch, but only if Robert would convince Sarah to marry him after Robert's death." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "He blackmailed a dying man?" "Not exactly blackmail," Doc said carefully. "More like extortion with a smile. Marcus positioned himself as the savior, the only solution to Sarah's impending financial ruin. Robert was desperate and dying. He couldn't bear the thought of Sarah losing everything her family had built over 3 generations. Doc opened the folder, revealing medical records and what appeared to be legal documents. Robert Johnson signed over power of attorney to Marcus Webb 6 months before his death. Marcus had access to all the ranch's financial records, all the bank accounts, everything. By the time Sarah learned about her father's illness, Marcus had already positioned himself as indispensable. Jake felt sick to his stomach. "Sarah doesn't know any of this?" Robert made me promise to never tell her. He died believing he was protecting his daughter, ensuring her security. He had no idea that Marcus had been systematically isolating Sarah from potential help, intercepting letters, and even ... quotes. Doc paused, looking uncomfortable. "Even what, Doc?" "Even intercepting letters from you. Marcus brought me Sarah's mail to deliver personally when she was caring for her father. Said he didn't want her bothered with distractions during such a difficult time. I thought he was being considerate." Jake left Doc Henderson's clinic with his world turned upside down and a burning need for justice. The woman he loved had been manipulated into a marriage based on lies, and his best friend had orchestrated the entire deception. But confronting Marcus directly would be his word against Marcus's, and Sarah might never believe the truth without proof. That afternoon, Jake drove to the county courthouse, determined to dig deeper into the financial records surrounding the Johnson Ranch. The clerk, an old classmate named Betty, was sympathetic to his plight and helped him access public records. What they discovered was even more damning than Doc Henderson's revelations. Marcus Webb had indeed paid off the ranch's debts, but not out of generosity. He had purchased the debt from the banks at a fraction of its value, then used that debt as leverage to force the marriage agreement. Additionally, the marriage had been structured so that Marcus gained full legal ownership of the ranch, with Sarah having no legal claim despite being her father's heir. "This is fraud," Betty whispered as they reviewed the documents. "Sarah should have inherited the ranch outright. These papers show that Marcus had her sign away her inheritance rights as part of the marriage agreement, claiming it was just a formality for tax purposes." Jake photographed every relevant document with his phone, building a case that would expose Marcus's deception. But he knew that legal proof might not be enough to undo the emotional damage. Sarah had built a life with Marcus, had a child with him. Even if she learned the truth, would she be willing to tear apart the only stability she'd known? As evening approached, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He drove to the Johnson Ranch, parked in the open driveway, and walked directly to the front door. If he was going to confront this situation, he would do it honestly and openly, giving Sarah the respect she deserved to hear the truth from him directly. Marcus answered the door, his face going pale when he saw Jake standing on the porch. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of their shared history and current circumstances hanging heavy in the air. "Jake," Marcus finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I heard you were in town. I was wondering when you'd show up. We need to talk, Marcus. All three of us." Jake's voice was steady but filled with quiet authority. From inside the house, Jake heard Sarah's voice calling out, "Who is it, honey?" The endearment directed at Marcus felt like another knife to Jake's heart, but he steeled himself for what was to come. Marcus stepped outside and closed the door behind him, clearly hoping to keep the conversation private. "Jake, I know this is hard, but Sarah's moved on. We have a life together now, a family. I think it's best if you just leave things as they are." "A life built on lies," Jake replied quietly. "I know about your arrangement with her father, Marcus. I know about the intercepted letters, the manipulated finances, all of it." Marcus's composure cracked slightly, a flicker of fear crossing his features. "I don't know what you're talking about. I helped Robert when he was sick, and I've taken care of Sarah ever since. That's what friends do. Friends don't forge marriages through extortion and fraud." Jake pulled out his phone, showing Marcus the photograph documents. "This ends now, Marcus. Sarah deserves to know the truth." The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Willow Creek for years to come. When Sarah finally emerged from the house, having heard raised voices on her porch, she found the two most important men from her past locked in a heated argument that would unravel the carefully constructed lie her life had become. Jake presented the evidence methodically and gently, giving Sarah time to process each revelation. The intercepted letters explaining why his correspondence had stopped. The financial manipulation that had trapped her father into arranging her marriage. The legal documents that had stripped her of her inheritance rights. Most devastating of all, the timeline that proved Marcus had orchestrated the entire situation while positioning himself as her savior. Sarah's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a crushing heartbreak as the full scope of the deception became clear. The man she had married, the father of her child, had systematically destroyed her agency and built their relationship on a foundation of manipulation and lies. Marcus's denials became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted. He claimed he had acted out of love, that he had protected Sarah from financial ruin, that he had given her stability when Jake had abandoned her. But each justification only highlighted the calculated nature of his actions and his complete disregard for Sarah's right to make her own choices. The most heartbreaking moment came when Sarah realized that her father had died believing he was protecting her, never knowing that his trusted friend was manipulating his illness for personal gain. The grief she had processed was now compounded by the knowledge that her father's final months had been poisoned by Marcus's deception. In the days that followed, legal proceedings began to restore Sarah's rightful ownership of the ranch. The marriage, built on fraud and coercion, was annulled. Marcus faced charges for financial fraud and emotional manipulation. The community that had once admired his apparent generosity now understood the calculated nature of his actions. For Sarah and Jake, the path forward was complicated by years of manipulation, missed opportunities, and the presence of Sarah's young son, who was innocent in all of this, but whose very existence was a reminder of the life built on lies. They approached their reunion carefully, taking time to rebuild trust and understanding, knowing that their love had survived separation, betrayal, and deception. The ranch prospered under Sarah's management, supported now by Jake's rodeo winnings and his determination to build the life they had originally planned. Their story became a testament to the power of truth over manipulation, love over convenience, and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when it's painful. Marcus Webb left Willow Creek in disgrace, his reputation destroyed and his freedom restricted by legal consequences. The community learned valuable lessons about the difference between genuine kindness and calculated manipulation, about the importance of asking questions when situations seemed too convenient, and about the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah and Jake, a second chance at love, was deeper and more meaningful because it had been tested by the worst kind of betrayal and had emerged stronger. They married the following spring in a ceremony that celebrated not just their love, but their triumph over deception and their commitment to building a future based on honesty, respect, and genuine partnership.